I am delighted to introduce our next keynote, which will be given by Professor Mirjam van Reisen, who is the Chair of Fair Data Science at the LUMC. We're also joined by our colleague, Professor Francisca Oladipo, who is a Professor of Computing at the Federal University of Lokoja in Nigeria. Together, they are two of the biggest driving forces behind the Vodun Africa and Asia project. Mirjam is the global principal investigator and Francisca is the executive coordinator. As well as the chair at the LUMC, Mirjam is also the Professor of International Relations, Innovation and Care at Tilburg University. And until recently, she was also the chair of Computing for Society at the Leiden Institute of Advanced Computer Science. And that's where we met a number of years ago now. Mirjam's main interests then involved how technology, particularly mobile technology and big data, can change society. And she was focusing at that time on the use of mobile technology in human trafficking. So quite a different story, really. When she came to Leiden, she was immediately interested in the new developments around fair data and how fair sharing of health data might help shape and change society, hopefully for the better. Her initial observations, however, identified quite some bias in the FAIR literature. She noticed that most work happened in Europe and the US. And so she set to work at looking at how fair data might impact digital health, specifically in Africa. And so we started collaborating with each other and also a number of different institutes and clinics across Africa. When the pandemic began, the emerging digital health network, which had just started, became Vodun Africa. And Vodun stands for the Virus Outbreak Data Network, and it's a large consortium of scientists across Europe, Asia, and Africa who are working together to use fair data to help case reports for COVID and to develop new ways of using the fair data that comes out of that. I met Francisca as part of that project. And she's also interested in how computer science can shape society. She's very interested as well in how computer science can shape society and education. She's the Chief Technical Advisor of the Joint Admissions and Matriculations Board and also the facilitator of the African Center of Excellence for Technology and Learning for the National Open University in Nigeria. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Mirjam for your presentation about Vodun Africa.
Well, thank you very, very much, Katie. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I was saying as we were sitting in the green room that the presentation so far has really been brilliant. And it's interesting to see how so many initiatives and research initiatives are coming together around healthcare and life sciences. With the use of semantic data. So it's a great pleasure to present here today together with Francisca, the executive coordinator, as you said, of Vodun Africa. We use both Vodun Africa and Vodun Africa and Asia because our researchers is really a global network with colleagues in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the US. But the work that we have done and that I'm presenting here today is really the work that we have done within the context of Africa. So our mission at Vodun Africa is to really work with the reality as it came into place with the pandemic and looking at how fair data can assist in solutions that also benefit Africa, but also benefit the global data available on the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of the presentation, I will first go through this presentation and then I also hope that Francisca will add on to what has been presented in this slideshow. I will first take you through the problem that we had identified or that we have identified, then say something about our research group, then present the architecture and the results that we have so far, and then some questions for, as they have come up, for further research. So, the problem is quite a big problem in that if you look at the available data on COVID-19, Africa really doesn't appear adequately in this global available data. And moreover, the data from Africa which is available is incredibly incomplete. And a third really big problem is that the data that is available is not used and is not usable at point of care. So these are three big interrelated problems that I'd like to illustrate here. You see here the latest distribution of COVID-19 cases worldwide, and the top here is the African data, and it's very, very difficult to determine whether this is a sort of a real picture of Africa not being affected so much by COVID-19, or that this would indicate that the data is just simply not available. And here you see a similar picture emerging in relation to the distribution of COVID-19 death, where again, the number of deaths recorded from Africa is disproportionately small. Here you see this being presented on a map. And well, here we have done, or the colleagues in Vodan, Dr. Sakinat from Nigeria and together with Professor Francisca have looked at the diversity here on COVID infections within Nigeria. Here you see the capital Lagos, and you see that the diversity within the country is actually large, but that this is not reflected in the data as they're usually presented per country or continent. And then, well, where we are today is that we know how the variants of concern have become very important in the combat of COVID-19. We know that Omicron was first detected in South Africa. What we don't know if that was the case because of, well, something particularly well done in terms of picking it up by researchers in South Africa, or that Omicron really has emerged from the African continent. We don't know, and it's really not knowable at this point. Most of the data from Africa are, we can say, really missing, as can be seen also on this map of Omicron variant detection. So we have asked in our group what the reason is that this data is missing, and there are quite a number of reasons, probably also not exhaustive here, but what we have identified is, first of all, that in the lower middle income countries, until recently, regulatory frameworks for data management was missing and also not enforced, and that there has really emerged a large culture of data extraction, especially taking data away from the continent into clouds that are then in Europe or the US, and this data never returns. What we also noted is that where in health facilities data are produced, this data is produced to be moved for analytics in other continents, notably Europe and the US, but that they really don't have any purpose in the health facility where this data is produced. And therefore, this data has actually little value. and at the place of where this data is produced. And we have observed that this really undermines both the quality and the value of this data, which really is being typed in generally and then moved away and doesn't return in any kind of way in that facility. At a larger scale, we had observed that as well in the Ebola crisis in West Africa, which was in which digital health really played an important role to get this crisis under control. But the overall set of the data about this about the prevalence of Ebola and how it was combated in, for instance, Liberia, is no longer available in that country. So the data ownership is something that we identified as a critical issue. And here you see, for instance, an example of a hospital flow where the data is recorded on paper. It is typed into a data management health information system, in this case, DHIS2. And then the data is moved out. The data never returns in any kind of way for use in this health facility. So the doctors only work with the paper versions of the patient records. So here you see another kind of image of the same. The data is captured on paper. It is entered in the hospital in a digital version, but then is moved away to another continent in warehouses and analyzed, but the reports do not return in the cases that we investigated in the health facilities. The issues that we identified for kind of the requirements for a design of a solution was the lack of data ownership as a critical issue, the lack of data security from the perspective of the health facility. Basically, the data are moved away and there's no control left over it from the perspective of the facility. The lack of data interoperability, and also the missing of any practical information or visualization or analytics that emerges from the data that is produced. If we link that to the problem for data collection on COVID, then the conclusion is that this leads to very limited data from low and middle income countries, that the data is unreliable and incomplete, that there really is a lack of interest from partners because there is really no benefit from this as the data warehouses are completely inaccessible from where they are and not relevant to the work that is being done in the health facilities. We noticed the lack of interoperability as a big problem, and this results all in an insufficient diversity of data and therefore a bias towards Western geographies, which is a problem for the African context that we studied, but is also a problem globally because it doesn't allow us to pick up issues such as, for instance, the variants of concern on COVID-19. So then what is the challenge? The challenge is that we needed to work on the availability of data in vulnerable and remote settings, that we felt that the data localization and ownership should be key, and that we should be cognizant of the regulatory frameworks within all of those places where data could be produced or is produced but is not functioning within the health care system. And that the data production should be relevant to local practices. and that we started to then reflect how the FAIR principles could really be meaningful to create an interoperability in the data, but that this would also require a new capacity to enhance the skills for data curation. So that meant that at some point we began to reflect on how the FAIR principles could lead to fairer data, and how really GDPR actually provided a very good framework because it sets such a clear principle on the need for ownership of data. So we have combined both FAIR and GDPR as leading principles, and we combined that with the logic of ensuring always a compliance with the regulatory framework in place. So with this, the design that we have started to look at is really led by the idea of federated data curation within a community that is provided by Vodafone Africa, and to ensure that the data is curated as machine readable, so that it can strengthen the interoperability with a analytical tooling that strengthens the quality of data at point of care, and also through data visiting allows us to analyze data across different sovereign countries. So this is the current network. We are working with stakeholders in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Liberia, Tunisia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And we have researchers from Indonesia, China, and Kazakhstan, and of course Leiden. And we work closely with the Stanford group of CEDAR. The cross-border issue on data visiting is an important issue, not actually just in the African context as is shown here, but also an important issue. For instance, we look at the European geography. This is a picture from 2017 when FAIR as a foundation for the European for the African Open Science Cloud was discussed in the Africa Health Commission of the East Africa community. Now I would like to show this short video, which kind of gives the essence of the Vodafone Africa group. So, so this is how we set up the research group with universities in all of the different countries I mentioned. And we realized that the problem that we were working on can be identified as what can be called a wicked problem. And a wicked problem requires an interdisciplinary approach. Because you need to really combine different angles and different, well, scientific areas of scientific expertise. An integration of stakeholders so that we would really combine the academic efforts with the experiences of different stakeholders related to this problem. And so we set out to work with an ethnographic design study and with a very strong emphasis on the ecological validity. What happens when we actually bring the proposed solutions into practice? So in the first phase, we decided on the key requirements and principles, and these were based on the combination of FAIR and GDPR, as well as the compliance with the regulatory framework in each country, which we measured by FAIR equivalency. And we looked at how the framework in the different countries was compliant with FAIR principles. Then in our first architecture, in the first phase, we worked with a limited number of data. They were based on a metadata form produced from the electronic report form on COVID of the WHO. This was a successful proof of concept, and we could demonstrate that we could do the data visiting within different countries on this data. But it had the disadvantage that it really provided us with very little flexibility and therefore very little possibility to really ensure that the data production was really tuned in with the different realities in the different health facilities within the different countries. So in the second phase, which started exactly 1 year ago in January 2021, we decided to work with CEDAR so that we would be able to work with a flexible setup of templating the metadata as they were used for the different patient record forms in the different health facilities. And we then set out what the benefits would be for this, for the health clinics, and how this would be deployed. And then that led to the schema that is available here, that we would have one editor for all of the data produced only one time, and the clinical patient metadata would be reposited in a residence, from which then they would be outputted in the health information system that the government in some countries uses. And this data would then result in a visualization of the clinical data within that particular health facility, so that is immediately usable at point of care, and a joint aggregate visualization in an aggregate dashboard available for the community. I will show this in a moment. Well, here you see that the result of this proposal was that very quickly 84 health facilities accepted to be part of this trial. They are not paid, it's a voluntary participation. So this kind of showed the interest that there was, which we were quite surprised about. I think we were initially hoping that we would have 20 health facilities. So when we had 84, we put a stop on it, because otherwise we thought it would be unmanageable. In some countries, particularly in Tunisia, they worked with remote communities on which no facility data on COVID-19 were available. And these research data were also integrated within the CDAR-based templates, so that they would be interoperable with the health facility data. And here you see the combination of both clinics and university data on COVID prevalence. Here you see the it says 85, but it's 84 health facilities, 9 countries, 12 universities, and we are expanding to 15 countries. So then the state of play, let me go to that now. Data visiting and control layers have been agreed and implemented. That leads to this fair data point schema, and the response is produced from the backend service after the request has gone through the API. And of course, different levels of data produce different levels of accessibility and possibilities for reuse. This is the current architecture that we are putting in place in a containerized version, ready-made for each of the facilities. And here you see the interoperability between the data that is and remains and is reposited in the health facility where it is curated, and here the data from the research side, which can be researched in an interoperable data visiting mode. This is the data production editor, which allows for flexible templates. At the moment, we have 3 for each of the facilities: the outpatients records, the mother and child care records, and the COVID-19 prevalence and death registration records. Here you see the metadata as they are produced, in this case in JSON LD format. Again, this is just to emphasize that the data remains within the facility and within the national border, and the querying process goes across to create the analytical, analytics, both for the external dashboard across countries in aggregate way, and in the internal dashboard working with the data within that facility. The internal dashboards are only accessible within that facility, and the external dashboards are accessible across all of the facilities. That then results in this dashboard. This is the dashboard overview, the overview of all of the 84 facilities. The facility dashboard, which is only accessible for the facility itself, and working with the data produced by that facility. And then the aggregate dashboard obtained through the data visiting in the 84 facilities. We have produced a digital innovation and skills hub, which includes the training of fair data curation and in the context of community health. And it's our partner, Kampala International University, that under the leadership of Professor Francisca has produced this hub. Now, for the next design phase, our interest is in looking how we can make the querying more flexible, more dynamic, and also create data for AI based on the aggregate data produced through this architecture, but always with a way back in investigating the provenance and context of this data. Well, with that, I would like to thank you for listening to the presentation and to hand over to the chair, Katie, and to Professor Francisca for any additions and discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirjam, for a fantastic keynote presentation. Perhaps it's good to actually invite Professor Francisca to say a few words in response to what Mirjam's already said before we go to the questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Katie, and it's good to have everyone here. That was a brilliant presentation by our global coordinator, Professor Mirjam, and then she has said it. Most of everything that we are doing in Northern Africa. I'm just going to add 2 points. The first one is that Northern Africa is the first successful implementation of data in residence and data visiting in the context of COVID-19. And now we're doing it in the context of the general healthcare data in the 86 clinics. It is also important to show that Northern Africa, to note that Northern Africa is actively involved in bridging 2 things, research and society, which is one of the key focuses of Professor Mirjam. So we have in the area of research, the data visiting, for example, data in residence. I remember at one of our meetings with Google, Professor Mirjam and I were really the only ones who were talking about the context of data in residence. It's something that is alien to most database researchers. And then this has also put Africa on the global map for data generation. There is this general impression that African nations are consuming nations, and we have a lot of a global open data set on practically everything. How much does Africa contribute to this data set? So Northern Africa is that project that ensures that Africa nations also contribute to the global data set. Now we have the research repository in Tunisia, and then we also have the healthcare repositories in all those clinics in the countries that have been mentioned, which means we now expect that researchers from all over the world can have their algorithms, computing algorithms, visit the data in residence, do the analytics, and then the producers of the data can also use their data under the governance of the country and do the analytics, while the data remains the property of the owners of the data. We have learned something from the Ebola crisis, and Northern Africa says, what happened with Ebola will not happen with any outbreak anymore in Africa. And that is why we're building this infrastructure, this data verification infrastructure, by now marrying research into the society. It is also important to know that we started from a state of 0 and getting to the hero part. Prior to the Northern Africa projects, the concept of fair data management with respect to data production was totally new to Africa. We have few researchers who working with Professor Mirjam and some of our colleagues at Leiden and Tilburg from Africa, especially East Africa, who were able to get introduced to the concept of fair data. But the core researchers in Africa had no idea. Now we have several universities through the GATE network and the Modern Africa network who are actually now going to have a curriculum on fair data management. We have the data stewardship system in KIU, we have in Mekele, we have in IBB UL in Nigeria, we have in Kampala International University, which I've mentioned that, we have in Kenya, across all the different countries. So in addition to the fact that we're improving data production and then making Africa a source of verified data on healthcare and every aspect of research, we're also building capacities. During the COVID-19, we were meeting online every week, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. We're able to do all the installation of the fair data points in the 8 countries at that time, the 9 fair data points. We did them all through virtual guided installation. So we have researchers in Leiden, we have in Kazakhstan, we have in Indonesia, and we have people in Nigeria. And through a guided live installation, we installed in all the hospitals in those countries last year during the COVID because we could not physically come together. And now we have also gotten used to learning over the internet. The DISH curriculum will be by e-learning completely. And our colleagues in war-torn areas like in northern Ethiopia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, can now learn different subjects, fair on the fair data management, customary law, community law, primary healthcare, across 11 subject areas through e-learning. Modern Africa is also supporting this capacity building. Those are my contributions, and I will be happy to take questions from the participants on the Modern Africa project. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Francisca. It's really interesting that actually the fact that we're all online more has become quite a positive thing for this network. That's quite a surprising thing. Normally when we talk about the pandemic and the fact that we all have to be online, it's in a negative context, but actually here it's the opposite. It's really helped bring this community together. So I think that's a really nice outcome that probably nobody was expecting at the beginning. And I think it's a nice positive way to start with the questions. Actually the first question comes from Marco, and seeing as he's online, maybe he can ask it himself. Marco, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie, and this is really wonderful talks and wonderful information. So my question is relates to sort of based on the assumption, I think it's a fair assumption to make, that when you do this in a fair way in Africa, when African countries have more control over the data, that will create more trust, and in that way stimulates data sharing from Africa. So more data will be available in a fair way from Africa. And I'm curious if you see, if you can say a few words about what value you see for the rest of the world, that there's more African data to work with.
Maybe I'll go first, and maybe Francisca wants to add on to that. Well, it's self-evident, obviously, and Omicron has showed it, that data of Africa is relevant for, in so many ways, for global research. One of the issues with lack of trust is, for instance, that genetic research is very difficult in the African context, because if you have no ownership, if you have no understanding what happens, if you have no benefit of this data, then why would you be ready to provide them? So pen and paper and a pencil can in fact sometimes feel more secure than digital data. And that is why Professor Francisca is rightfully emphasizing that this also has to do with capacity, but it also has to do with regulation, and it also has to do with the availability of broadband and of technical architecture. But one thing, Marco, that I would like to emphasize is that this, the benefit of the architecture is, I believe, not only in relation to the global accessibility of data to Africa or the benefit of this data to Africa itself, but what we discovered in as we were doing this research is that we have very similar problems all over the world. So for instance, in our discussion with Stanford, they were saying, yeah, but you know, it would be good if we also had an equivalent problem or benefit in the US. So yeah, I mean, we weren't really actually so sure, because our knowledge is really, I mean, we know the problem is there in Asia, we know the problem is there in Africa, but we weren't really so clear. Then they came up themselves with the equivalent from this really huge state of Montana, where populations are very thinly spread, but where you also have very important indigenous Native American populations who have really the same issue with mistrust on digital data, which has to do with history and has to do with the way in which they don't feel control over this data. So we've had actually very interesting discussions with researchers in Montana who've said, well, they will never make their data available. And where our answer has been, but it is their data, they will curate them, they will keep them in residence, and they will be entirely controlled by them. So I feel that the most important thing of what we have achieved so far is to show that keeping data in residence is a good way to enhance data analytics through federated techniques. And I think that will be actually beneficial to solutions over and above the African continent, but really can enhance generally the trust in data use, data production, and therefore the use of this data for analytics. Yeah, so it's a good question. Thank you. Francisca, do you want to add to that?
Nothing much, just to emphasize the trust issue on this federated data from Africa, because now researchers from the rest of the world are very certain that they're actually getting data from verifiable sources, data that are produced and then stored under the governance of the country. And it also brings a kind of completeness to their research, because most of the time you see presentation on data sources, you see Europe, you see North America, you see Asia, and the rest of the world. Africa is no longer going to be the rest of the world, but we can now specifically say from Nigeria, South Sudan, Kenya, no longer the rest of the world, but each country will have an identity due to Northern Africa's efforts.
The follow-up question I can also take maybe, Katie, because I do think that this will create aggregate data that can feed AI solutions. I showed in the a slideshow that, well, you obviously have these different levels of from being personalized to an entirely depersonalized level. And this is something that we definitely can work with. I do think that there will be a need from an ethical side and from a regulatory side to make sure that that really respects the spirit of GDPR and a lot of GDPR-like regulation that is currently emerging in Africa. But if we get it right, it means that the AI solutions will have much greater diversity of data to work with, while at the same time, we have pathways back to looking at provenance and context of the data. And that really will enhance the strength for AI solutions for health. But there's a lot of work that I believe still needs to be done in order to get it right. But it's not a technical problem. It's a problem of regulation and organizing access and control in proper ways.
Yeah, so that brings me to a question of my own, actually. So you said that the data visiting agreements that you made, if you have 84 different clinics with all of these different regulatory frameworks, how much of an effort was that part just to get those agreements in place? Was that one of the major hurdles for the project? Is that something that's now solved, or is that an ongoing issue that you have to keep coming back to?
I feel, but I'll keep it short because Francisca can speak to it better. I feel that by using the most stringent principles of data ownership with GDPR on the one hand and FAIR and data in residence on the other hand, we basically covered all concerns of suspicion, and therefore we got a lot of space from ministries of health to show and to demonstrate what this could offer. So actually, I don't feel that we have had a lot of emphasis works within that regulatory framework because we choose the most severe set of requirements. Francisca, how would you answer this question?
Yes. I will like Kathy to know that we have all the countries participating in Bodan Africa already signed the Bodan Africa Partnership Agreement that has been signed. And then for the Health Facilities Agreement, because our agreement once conforms with the GDPR, which is where our funders are from, and then with the FAIR principles of the Go Fair Foundation and the specific privacy and data protection laws of the country. We actually quote that, the year, the title of the law and everything. So we have had major compliance. And the body of country coordinators have, yes, they have also on the drive to get the individual health facilities to sign. Some that has autonomy already signed. Like in Niger State, we got a letter from the Minister for Health that gave a blanket approval for the health facilities to go ahead and sign the agreement. So in some cases, we have to do case by case, but in some countries, they have a uniform system and we have quoted the data privacy laws. They're fine with it. So we didn't really have much hurdles with the signing of the agreement.
Okay, so building capacity at the beginning has really paid off in that respect. Yeah. So we are almost out of time, but I think we have time for a short question. And this question comes from Africa as well, from South Africa, from Marika. And she says that often the benefit of sharing data with the North doesn't return to benefits in Africa. And you've both spoken to that already. The analytics tools, novel algorithms developed with or done, the data is then not shared back. Will all your analytics tools be open source for Africans to use freely?
Not just for Africans, globally. So everything is on GitHub, everything is in open source. And I should also pay really tribute, as Professor Francisca has done, is that, of course, we've worked with Leiden, we've worked with Go Fair Foundation, we have worked with Stanford. But the core of what has been developed as tooling has really been done by the African engineers, and it fits within what is working within that architectural context. So Marika, if you're from South Africa, we'll be very, very much keen to make sure that we share all of that with you, but also make sure that on the PowerPoint, the GitHub and everything is available. It's obviously important to work within the community, as in any fair community, to really get the best conditions for interoperability. But at the same time, any initiative will contribute to a fairer environment in the future, and that is what we're looking for.
Yes. Additionally, if I may just add to that, within our Africa communities, we have graduate students, masters and PhD, whose research are within the work of Bodan Africa. They're going to produce their thesis, verify them. Of course, we have under the GATE network. We are now all the Bodan Africa thesis under the GATE network will go into the Fair Data Point in Tunisia and in other institutions in the GATE network, so the works will be available. Additionally, we have also published. We have Professor Mirjam, 23 articles now that are on the data intelligence published by MIT Press. So yes, the dissemination, and we are not excluding everyone. They are going to be freely available, open source to the entire community, everyone.